In a land choked by plague, her hands could heal the dying. For this gift, they called her a witch. The Baron, a man desperate to hide his own failures, sentenced her to the pyre. She was abandoned by all, her kindness repaid with fire, and her fate sealed. But then he arrived. General Kale, the kingdom's legendary warrior, now living in darkness, a hero blinded in battle. He could not see the witch they condemned. He could only hear the truth in her voice. And in that moment, a man who had lost his sight chose to see a soul, an act that would challenge a tyrant and forge a destiny. The village of Oakhaven was drowning in a sea of mud and misery. A relentless, chilling rain had turned the streets to sludge, mirroring the sickness that had settled deep in the lungs of its people. They called it the gray lung, a rasping cough that stole the breath and left a stain of blood on the lips, a final grim promise. Fear was the only currency left, and it was a coin, the Baron of Oakhaven, Valerius, spent with abandon. In a small, mud-caked cottage, a child's breath rattled like stones in a wooden box. His name was Thomas, and his mother, Ilara, had already begun to grieve. The Baron's own physician, a man of expensive robes and useless theories, had shaken his head and departed, leaving only the scent of failure behind. But now there was another presence in the room. Anya. She was not a creature of title or wealth. Her dress was simple wool, her hands stained with dirt, and herbs not adorned with rings. She moved with a quiet purpose, her focus entirely on the small, feverish body before her. She crushed mallow root into a paste, the rhythmic thump of her pestle a steady heartbeat in the tense silence. She did not chant or incant. She simply worked, her knowledge a gift passed down through generations, a wisdom of the earth that the Baron's books could not comprehend. She gently lifted the boy's head, urging him to drink a hot tea brewed from linden flowers. Her voice was low and soft, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. "Just a little," she whispered, her touch impossibly gentle. "Let the warmth soothe you." Ilara watched, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She had been warned against this. Anya was an outsider, a woman who lived in the woods, whose ways were not their ways. But desperation had been a stronger counsel than fear, and then a change. The rattling in Thomas's chest began to soften. The violent flush on his cheeks subsided to a pale pink. With a final shuddering sigh, his breathing eased into the deep, even rhythm of peaceful sleep. The fever had broken. Ilara fell to her knees, not in worship, but in a wave of profound, exhausted relief. Tears streamed down her face as she reached for her son's hand, feeling the healthy warmth that had been absent for days. "He's cool," she sobbed, looking at Anya with eyes full of disbelief and awe. "You saved him." The news traveled as fast as the sickness itself. A small crowd had gathered outside the cottage, their faces pale and gaunt in the fading light. They saw Ilara's tears of joy, they heard her breathless praise, and a flicker of hope ignited among them. But hope, in Oakhaven, was a dangerous flame. The thunder of hooves cut through the murmurs. Baron Valerius arrived, his fine velvet cloak splattered with mud, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Flanked by two thuggish guards, he dismounted, his eyes immediately landing on Anya as she stepped out of the cottage. "What is this?" the Baron boomed, his voice carrying an artificial weight. "What sorcery has been performed here?" His physician, a weaselly man named Fenwick, pointed a trembling finger. "My lord, the boy was beyond saving. His recovery is unnatural." Anya stood tall, her hands clasped before her. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep weariness. "It was no sorcery, my lord. It was a simple remedy of mallow root and linden flower." The Baron laughed, a harsh and ugly sound. "Herbs? Do you hear her? She claims herbs succeeded where my learned physician failed. She mocks our intelligence. She mocks our faith." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial hiss for the crowd to hear. "This is the devil's work, a life for a life. She has made a dark pact to grant this miracle, and the price will be paid by all of us." The villagers shuffled, their flicker of hope instantly extinguished by the familiar shadow of fear. They knew the Baron. They knew his temper. It was easier to believe in witchcraft than to challenge a man who controlled their food, their homes, their very lives. "Seize her!" the Baron commanded. The guards moved forward. Anya did not resist as their rough hands gripped her arms. She looked from one villager's face to another, seeking a single glance of support, a memory of the help she had given their families in the past. She found none. They looked at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at her. They had chosen their side. "For the crime of witchcraft," the Baron proclaimed, his voice ringing with false piety, "for bringing a foul darkness into our midst, you will be purified by fire. At dawn you will burn." A cold dread, sharp and absolute, pierced through Anya's composure. The image of flames, hot and consuming, flashed in her mind. Still, she would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. Her silence was her last remaining shield. They dragged her through the mud toward the village's small, windowless holding cell. As the heavy oak door groaned open, she caught one last glimpse of the sky, a bruised purple twilight that promised a dawn she was not meant to see. The door slammed shut, the heavy bolt scraping into place, plunging her into absolute darkness. The chill of the stone floor seeped into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the cold of utter abandonment. Dawn and the fire that awaited it was only hours away, and in the whole of Oakhaven not a single soul would speak for her. The rain had softened to a mist, clinging to the world in a gray shroud. Through it came a slow, rhythmic sound that did not belong to the miserable village of Oakhaven. It was the sound of heavy war horses, their shod hooves sure-footed in the mud, and the soft jingle of clean, well-oiled steel. It was the sound of discipline. At the head of the small column rode a man who sat straighter than any king. His armor was dark and unadorned, practical and fearsome. A thick, gray-streaked beard covered a jawline that seemed carved from granite, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. They were a startling pale blue, but they did not see. A long, jagged scar ran from his right temple, across the bridge of his nose, and ended just below his left eye. A permanent map of the moment his world had gone dark. This was General Cale, the Butcher of the East, the king's own shield, now a man returning to his self-imposed exile. As they neared the village square, Cale raised a single hand. The column of a dozen veteran soldiers halted instantly, their discipline absolute. The general tilted his head, his face a mask of concentration. In the 5 years since he had lost his sight, his other senses had sharpened into weapons. He could discern a lie in the slight tremor of a man's voice, read a battlefield by the sound of boots on stone, and sense fear like a change in the air. And now he heard it. The voice of Baron Valerius, loud and pompous, straining to sound powerful. Cale recognized the brittle edge of panic beneath it. He heard the sycophantic affirmations of another man, a voice slick with weakness. And underneath it all, he heard the chilling silence of a crowd too terrified to speak. It was the sound of a wolf cornering a sheep, and the general's hand tightened on his reins. "At dawn, she will burn," the Baron's voice echoed across the square. Kyle's expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He had heard pronouncements like that before, on battlefields where justice was a luxury. But this was not a battlefield. This was a village of farmers and woodcutters. This was not the sound of justice, but of tyranny. He nudged his horse forward, the great beast parting the silent crowd like a ship through water. His men followed, their presence an intimidating wall of silent steel. Baron Valerius spun around, his face a comical mixture of shock and fury at the interruption. "General Cale," he stammered, recovering slightly. "An unexpected honor. We are merely cleansing our village of a dark influence." Kyle did not look at the Baron. His face was angled slightly toward the pyre, toward the source of the quiet dignity he sensed in the air. "Cleansing?" Cale's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was a voice that had commanded 10,000 men and it effortlessly silenced the baron's blustering. With fire? That is a judgment reserved for the highest courts, Baron, not for a village spectacle. This is my domain, Valerius retorted, puffing out his chest. The witch was caught in the act of her dark magic. The people are witness. Cale's sightless eyes seemed to bore into the Baron. He had heard this all before. He had seen good men and women condemned by the fear of weak leaders. He had made a promise to himself in the darkness of his recovery. He would no longer stand by and watch injustice masquerade as strength. This was a promise he intended to keep. By royal decree of the king himself, the general stated, his voice ringing with an authority the Baron could not match. Any and all accusations of witchcraft that carry a sentence of death must be reviewed by a king's magistrate. It is the law. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the stunned crowd. She is now under my protection, pending that judgment. In a world cowed by fear, a single voice of reason can be a revolution. It is a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. If you believe in the power of standing for what is right, click like to support the general's decree. Baron Valerius turned a dangerous shade of red. He was being overruled, humiliated in front of his own people. But to challenge General Cale, a man who still held the king's favor despite his injury, was unthinkable. It was a choice between his pride and his head. As you wish, General, Valerius ground out, his voice dripping with venom. But if this village suffers further from her curse, the fault will be yours. Cale ignored him completely. Release her, he commanded, his voice directed at the two guards holding Anya. They looked at the Baron, who gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The guards unlocked the iron manacles. The metal fell away with a clang that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. For a moment, Anya didn't move. Her wrists were raw, her mind reeling. She could not comprehend what had just happened. This man, this legendary, fearsome warrior, had appeared from the mists and spoken the law as if it were a sword, cutting her free. One of Cale's soldiers gently took her arm. "Come, mistress," he said, his voice surprisingly kind. He led her away from the pyre through the parted crowd and stopped her directly in front of the general's immense war-horse. She looked up, her gaze tracing the strong lines of Cale's face, the noble set of his jaw, and finally the deadened, scarred eyes. He could not see her simple dress, the mud on her cheek, or the stunned hope that was beginning to dawn in her expression. And Cale sat perfectly still, listening. He heard the soft, ragged sound of her breathing. He smelled the faint, clean scent of crushed herbs and damp earth that clung to her. He sensed not a dark power, but a quiet, resilient life. She was real. And now she was his responsibility. A silent question hung in the air between them, as vast and as uncertain as the road that now lay ahead. What had he just done? The journey from Oakhaven was a silent one. Anya rode on a small mare tethered to the saddle of one of Cale's soldiers. No one spoke to her. The general rode at the head of the column, his back a rigid wall of dark steel, a silent, unapproachable figure leading her into an unknown future. The rhythmic plodding of the horses was the only sound, a steady, hypnotic beat that carried her further and further from the life she had known. With every mile, the fear of the flames receded, replaced by the sharp, cold edge of uncertainty. After hours of travel through winding, rocky highlands, the fortress appeared. It did not rise gracefully from the landscape. It seemed to erupt from it, an extension of the mountain itself. Stonehaven. The name was apt. It was a fortress of wind-scoured granite, with high, stark walls and narrow windows that looked like suspicious eyes peering out over the desolate moors. There were no banners, no flourishes of color. It was a place built for survival, not comfort, a perfect reflection of the man who commanded it. The great iron-banded gate groaned open, its echo swallowed by the vast, empty courtyard within. The few guards on duty did not shout greetings. They offered silent, crisp salutes as the general passed. The discipline was absolute, the quiet profound. It was a silence entirely different from the fearful hush of the village. This was a silence of order, of purpose, of grief, held so long it had become part of the stone. Anya was helped down from her horse, her legs unsteady. An older woman with a severe face and hair pulled into a tight gray knot approached them. Her name was Iona, and she was Stonehaven's steward, a woman whose loyalty to the general was etched into the stern lines of her face. "The general asked me to see to you," Iona said, her voice devoid of emotion. She did not look at Anya with pity or scorn, but with a flat, assessing gaze. "Follow me." Anya followed her. Through echoing stone corridors, her simple shoes making no sound on the worn flagstones. She felt the weight of the castle settle upon her. It was a place of ghosts and memories, where every shadow seemed to hold a story of loss. She was acutely aware that she was an intruder here, a complication brought into a world that had long since closed its doors. Iona led her to a small room in a quiet wing of the fortress. The door was heavy oak, but it had no lock on the outside. Inside, the chamber was sparse but impeccably clean. A narrow bed was made with a thick wool blanket, a stark contrast to the damp straw of the village cell she had expected. A ceramic pitcher of fresh water and a single cup sat on a small wooden table. It was not a guest's chamber, but neither was it a prisoner's cell. It was something in between. "You will be safe here," Iona stated, as if daring Anya to question it. "You are not to wander the fortress. Your meals will be brought to you." With that, she turned and left, her footsteps receding down the long hall, leaving Anya in absolute silence. For a long moment Anya did not move. She simply stood in the center of the room, listening. There were no jeering voices, no rattling keys, no crackle of a pyre being built. There was only the distant moan of the wind against the stone. It was the sound of utter isolation, and yet it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. A deep soul-shaking weariness washed over her, a fatigue that went beyond bone and muscle. The terror she had held at bay for 2 days finally released its grip, and her body trembled with the aftershock. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands, and for the first time since the Baron's guards had seized her, she allowed herself a single shuddering sob. It was a sound of grief for her lost life, but also one of profound, unbelievable relief. She was alive. She drank the water, the coolness a balm to her dry throat. She ran her hand over the rough weave of the blanket, a simple, solid object in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Here, in the silent Spartan room, no one was judging her. No one was calling her a witch. No one was demanding anything of her at all. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was simply left alone. The silence was a harbor, a temporary refuge from the storm. Later, as twilight painted the desolate landscape in shades of gray and deep violet, she moved to the narrow window. It looked out over a vast expanse of empty moorland stretching to a bruised horizon. There were no other castles, no villages, no roads in sight. She was utterly, completely alone, saved from one prison only to be delivered to another, a fortress of solitude ruled by a blind, silent guardian. Was this sanctuary? Or was it merely a different, quieter kind of cage? She wrapped her arms around herself, a fragile hope, wrestling with a deep, lingering fear. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to General Kale, and she had no idea what he intended to do with it. The first days in Stonehaven were a lesson in shadow and stone. For Anya, who had lived her life by the sun and the cycles of the moon, the fortress's endless torch-lit corridors were a disorienting maze. At night, when the torches burned low, the darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that left her feeling her way along the cold walls, her heart pounding with a primal fear of the unknown. She never made a sound, but her quiet fumbling desperation did not go unnoticed. In his study, a room filled with maps he could no longer see, General Kale would sit in perfect stillness, listening to the castle breathe. His hearing had become his sight, and he could trace Anya's hesitant footsteps in the halls as clearly as if he were watching her. He heard the small, frustrated sighs, the soft brush of her hands against stone as she sought a landmark. He recognized the sound of someone lost, and in his own endless darkness he understood it completely. The next morning Anya awoke to a change. A simple, rough-spun rope, thick and sturdy, had been strung along the main corridor wall. Running from the wing her room was in all the way to the great hall and the library. It was a simple, practical guide, a lifeline. She reached out and touched it, her fingers tracing the coarse fibers. There was no doubt in her mind who had done it. The general, in his darkness, had seen hers. He had not offered pity or words of comfort. He had given her a tool, a path. It was an act of profound, silent empathy, and for the first time she felt not like a prisoner, but like someone who had been seen. As the days turned into a week, Anya found a new purpose. Behind the kitchens lay a small, walled garden, long abandoned. Its stone beds were choked with weeds, the soil hard and neglected, but Anya, with her healer's eyes, saw the ghosts of what had been planted there, the faint, woody stems of lavender, the withered roots of chamomile, the stubborn remnants of a lemon balm bush. It was a garden of healing, left to die. It felt like a reflection of the castle's master. So she began to work. She pulled weeds until her hands were raw, she turned the soil, and she coaxed the dormant roots back to life. It was hard, patient work. She spoke to the plants as she had always done, her voice a low, gentle murmur. Slowly, miraculously, the garden began to respond. A sprig of green appeared, then another. The first time the scent of new. Lavender drifted on the breeze through the open window of Kyle's study. He froze. It was a scent from another life, from his childhood home, where his mother tended her own garden. It was the smell of peace, a memory he had long since buried under layers of grief and guilt. He found himself drawn to the window, not to see, but to breathe. He stood there for a long time, letting the familiar fragrance wash over him, a gentle tide eroding the shores of his solitude. He did not see the woman who toiled in the dirt, but he felt the life she was bringing back to his desolate world. The damp chill of the stone fortress eventually settled in Anya's chest, leaving her with a persistent dry cough. She tried to soothe it with the herbs she had, but it lingered. One evening, returning to her room, she found a small, unmarked wooden pot sitting on the floor outside her door. She picked it up. Inside was a thick, dark honey, almost black, with the potent, unmistakable scent of mountain thyme. She knew what it was immediately. This was not common honey from a village hive. This was a rare, powerful remedy, harvested from the highest, most dangerous peaks. It was a healer's gift, a gesture of immense care and startling thoughtfulness. He had noticed her discomfort and had sought out a cure. The unspoken dialogue reached its peak one moonless night. A storm raged outside, and a deep ache throbbed behind Cale's scarred eyes, a phantom pain from his old wound that no amount of wine could dull. He sat in the library, his head in his hands, his formidable control shattered by a pain no one could see. Anya, seeking a book on herbs, found him there. She saw not the fearsome general, but a man in agony. For a moment she hesitated at the door, a breath away from retreating into the shadows. But her healer's instinct was stronger than her fear. She moved to the hearth, her actions quiet and deliberate. She took a small cloth, warmed it by the fire, and mashed a poultice of willow, bark and feverfew from her own small pouch. She approached him slowly. He did not move, but she knew he was aware of her every step. "General," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He flinched, but did not look up. "I have something for the pain." She stood before him, holding out the small, warm bundle. A long silence stretched between them, thick with tension. He was a man who never showed weakness, a warrior who had built a fortress around his heart. To accept her help was to admit his vulnerability. To allow her to touch him was an act of profound trust. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hands and inclined his head. It was a surrender. With gentle, steady fingers, Anya applied the warm poultice to his temples. He drew a sharp breath as the warmth and the herbs began their work, but he did not pull away. She stood there, her hands resting lightly on his brow, in a silence that was more intimate than any conversation. In that moment, she was not a witch, and he was not a general. They were simply two souls in a quiet room, one offering comfort, the other brave enough to receive it. The bridge between them was no longer one of mere circumstance. It was being built, thread by silent thread, with gestures of unspoken care, a dialogue of the heart in a world that had forgotten how to listen. A strange and fragile peace had begun to settle within the cold walls of Stonehaven. The silence was no longer heavy with grief, but held a quiet anticipation. It could be felt in the scent of time from the recovering garden, in the sight of the rope guide hanging faithfully in the hall, and in the low, humming melodies Anya would sing to her plants. Kyle found himself listening for her footsteps, the soft, steady rhythm a comforting counterpoint to the howling of the wind. Her presence was a small, warm flame in the vast, cold darkness of his life. But peace is a delicate thing for a man haunted by war. One afternoon, while standing by his study window, breathing in the scent of the living garden, one of his men brought him a report. The soldier, a young man named Reese, mentioned that Baron Valerius had sent scouts near their territory. The Baron's name was a key, unlocking a door in Cale's mind that he had long tried to keep sealed. The scent of lavender vanished, replaced by the phantom smell of blood and wet iron. The present faded, and Cale was plunged back into the past, into the memory that defined him, the Battle of the Crimson Field. He had been at the height of his power then, the king's most trusted general, his name a legend. They were marching to crush a rebel uprising, and Baron Valerius, whose lands bordered the territory, had provided them with maps, insisting on a shortcut through a narrow canyon. Valerius had assured him it was secure. Kyle, proud and confident, had trusted the nobleman's word. He could still feel the press of the canyon walls, the sense of unease he had dismissed as caution. He remembered his second-in-command, his oldest friend Lorien, clapping him on the shoulder, his laugh echoing in the enclosed space. "The rebels won't know what hit them, old friend," Lorien had said. "We'll be drinking their wine by nightfall." Then came the sound, not the clash of steel, but a horrifying, whistling hiss, like 1,000 angry snakes. Arrows! They rained down from the canyon ridges, a black torrent of death. There was no shield wall, no room to form a line, no way to charge the unseen enemy. Above, it was not a battle. It was a slaughter, a trap. The memory was a storm of sensory chaos, the screams of men and horses, the sickening thud of arrows finding flesh, the metallic taste of his own fear. He saw Lorien fall, an arrow in his throat, his eyes wide with shocked betrayal. Cale had roared, a sound of pure animal rage, and charged toward the only escape, desperate to rally his men to save who he could. It was then that his world ended. A rebel warrior, dropping from a ledge, swung a heavy spiked mace. The blow did not kill him. It glanced off his helmet, a blinding flash of white-hot agony that seared through his eyes. He fell from his horse, his last sight, the blood-soaked ground of the canyon, a field of crimson where his ambition and his men had gone to die. He had awoken days later in a royal tent, the world a realm of muffled sounds and absolute darkness. They told him he was a hero, that his surviving men had eventually broken through. But Cale knew the truth. He had led over 1,000 soldiers into that canyon. Less than 200 had walked out. He had failed them. His pride had made him blind long before the enemy's mace ever did. His return to the capital was a torment. He heard the whispers behind his back, the pity in the king's voice. He was no longer the king's shield. He was a broken relic, a tragic story to be told by fireplaces. The guilt was a physical weight, a shroud he could not cast off. And so he had retreated to Stonehaven, his family's ancient and isolated fortress. He had locked himself away not just from the world, but from his own memory, choosing a prison of stone and silence as his penance. The memory released its grip, leaving Cale trembling and breathless by the window in his study. He was drowning in that sea of blood again, a ghost in his own home, the screams of the dying echoing in his ears. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The fortress was not a home, it was a tomb. He had built for his guilt. A soft footstep in the doorway pulled him from the wreckage of his past. Anya stood there, holding a small clay pot with a newly sprouted seedling. She had come to ask if she could place it in the library, where the afternoon sun was strongest. She saw the tension in his body, the bleak torment on his face, and the question died on her lips. She saw a man not in pain, but lost to it. He could not see her, but he felt her presence, a quiet warmth that cut through the chilling echo of his failure. She was the woman he had saved from the fire, a single, successful rescue in a life defined by loss. And she was a fragile, terrifying hope he did not believe he deserved. The fragile peace of Stonehaven was shattered by the thunder of approaching hooves. It was a sound of urgency and arrogance, and it did not belong to Cale's disciplined men. A party of 5 riders, flying the brown and gold banner of Baron Valerius, galloped into the courtyard as if they owned it. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel sneer, dismounted without waiting for permission. Kyle met them in the center of the yard, his posture erect, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Anya watched from the high window of the library, her hands pressed against the cold glass, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. She recognized the lead rider. He was the same man who had bound her wrists in the village. "General," the man said, his tone lacking any real respect, "I bring a message from my lord, Baron Valerius, and a decree from the king himself." Cale remained silent, letting the man's arrogance hang in the air. The rider unrolled a scroll with a flourish, though he did not read from it. "The gray lung plague has worsened since you took the witch from our lands. Her dark magic lingers. By order of the king, the witch Anya is to be returned to the barony to face her judgment by fire. His Majesty has sanctioned the baron's original sentence." Anya's blood ran cold. The king, the final authority in the land. She felt the floor beneath her sway. Cale had saved her by invoking the king's law, and now that same law was being used to condemn her. But Cale, a man who had spent 2 decades in the king's service, knew the sound of the king's command. He also knew the reek of desperation. The scroll the man held was a fabrication, the decree a panicked lie. He could hear the falsehood in the rider's overly confident tone. "You are mistaken," Cale said, his voice dangerously calm. "The king does not issue decrees through cowardly barons who cannot manage their own lands." The woman stays. The rider's sneer faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "This is not a request, General. The king's word is law." "Indeed," Cale replied, taking a single deliberate step forward. The rider's horses shifted nervously, sensing the shift in the air. "And the law says she is entitled to a fair hearing from a royal magistrate, a hearing she will receive. You will return to your baron and inform him that I will not surrender a soul under my protection to a liar and a tyrant." The rider was stunned into silence. He had expected the blind general to be a frail, broken man. He was facing a mountain. He remounted his horse, his face flushed with fury. "You defy the king, then," he spat. "The baron predicted this. He said you had fallen under the witch's spell. If she is not returned by tomorrow's sunrise, no food, no supplies, no one will enter or leave Stonehaven. You and your men will starve in this rock pile together, and the entire realm will know it was for a witch." With that, they wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like poison. A siege. It was a declaration of war. Loyalty is not a bond for times of peace. It is a shield forged in the fires of impossible choices. Kyle had made his choice, placing one innocent life above the comfort and safety of his entire household. If you believe in the strength of such loyalty, subscribe now to witness the storm they must face together. A heavy silence descended on the courtyard. Cale's men looked at him, their faces grim. They had pledged their lives to him, but he had just condemned them to starvation for a woman they barely knew. Later that evening, Anya found Cale in the library. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a terrible resolve. "General," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "I heard what the Baron's man said. You cannot let your men suffer for my sake. Let me go. I will give myself up." Kyle turned his head slowly toward the sound of her voice. "You believe your sacrifice would satisfy him?" he asked, his tone quiet. "A man like Valerius does not want justice. He wants power. Surrendering to him would not save my men. It would only prove to them that their general bows to threats and abandons those under his protection." "But they will starve," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It will be my fault." He took a step closer to her, his presence filling the room. "No," he said, his voice softer now, but with an edge of unshakable steel. "The fault lies with the man who would let his own people die of sickness while he wages war on a single woman. We will not surrender. We will not break. We will endure this together." The word hung in the air between them. Together. It was no longer a matter of a guardian and his ward. It was an alliance. Her safety was now tied to the survival of the fortress, and the fortress's survival was tied to the strength of their bond. The shadow of Baron Valerius was no longer a distant threat. It was at their gate, and the quiet dialogue of care was about to become a battle for their lives. The great gate of Stonehaven boomed shut, its final echoing clang sealing them off from the world. The siege had begun. A grim silence fell over the fortress, heavier than before. The small garrison of 24 loyal soldiers looked to their general, their faces etched with a mixture of hardened loyalty and gnawing uncertainty. They were warriors, but their new enemies were hunger and time. In these first tense days, Anya emerged not as a liability, but as a leader. She saw the quiet fear that a dwindling food supply brings, and she knew that sickness, born of want and close quarters, would be a far greater threat than the Baron's men. She went to the kitchens, where Iona was already taking a grim inventory. "We must purify all the drinking water," Anya stated, her voice calm and confident. "And I will prepare a daily tonic for every man. My garden has enough thyme and elderberry to bolster their strength against the gray lung and other fevers." Iona looked at the young woman, seeing not a witch, but a commander in her own right. She gave a single sharp nod. From that moment, Anya's garden became the heart of the fortress's defense. She worked tirelessly, her hands deep in the soil, creating remedies and ensuring the health of every person. Within the walls, the soldiers who had first viewed her with suspicion now accepted her tonics with gratitude, calling her the healer. She was no longer a guest or a prisoner, she was part of their shield. While Anya fortified the fortress from within, Cale prepared to fight the battle outside. He had his men, elite and loyal, but they were vastly outnumbered. Brute force was impossible. Victory would have to be found in his mind. He spent his days in the library, a massive, detailed map of the surrounding territories spread across the great table. It was a cruel irony, a blind man's world laid out on parchment he could not see. It was there that their true alliance was forged. "I need you to be my eyes, Anya," he said one afternoon, his voice low. She stood beside him at the table. "Tell me what you need to see," she replied without hesitation. His finger, scarred and calloused, rested on a section of the map near the supply road. "Here," he said. "The road winds through a pass. The Baron's supply wagons will have to use it. Describe it to me, not as a mapmaker would, as you see it." And so she began. She described the way the granite cliffs leaned over the road like tired old men. She told him of a small hidden ravine choked with hardy gorse bushes, a place where the shadows gather first at dusk. She remembered a stream that ran fast after a rain, turning the ground soft and treacherous. She painted a picture for him with her words, full of life and detail. And he absorbed it all, his mind building a perfect three-dimensional landscape from her voice. He listened, his head angled, his expression one of intense concentration. He cross-referenced her descriptions with his own military knowledge. "The Baron is an arrogant man," Cale mused, his finger tracing a path she had described. "He will believe his numbers make him safe. He will send his supply wagons with a light guard. He is also impatient, Anya added softly. He will want this over. Quickly, he will not have the discipline for a long siege. It was a perfect synergy. Her sight and her insight, his strategy and his authority. That night, Cale dispatched a small team of his best soldiers, not to fight, but to be ghosts. Following his precise instructions, born from Anya's memory, they navigated the darkness with ease. They did not attack the wagons. They spooked the horses, broke the axle of the lead cart in the narrowest part of the pass, and vanished into the shadows she had described. The result was chaos. The Baron's supply line was blocked for 2 full days. His men grew restless and hungry. A week later, another raid, just as precise, destroyed their reserves of fresh water. Cale and Anya's war room in the library became the engine of the fortress's defiance. They were a single unit, their conversations a fluid exchange of information and intuition. The Baron's siege began to crumble. His men, ill-fed and demoralized by an enemy they never saw, began to desert. Valerius, enraged and humiliated, was forced to accept the truth. He could not break Stonehaven. One morning, the sentries reported that the Baron's massive war camp was being dismantled. His forces were retreating in disgrace. A cheer went up through the fortress, a raw, triumphant sound. The soldiers clapped each other on the back, their relief immense. But in the library, there was only a profound, breathless silence. Cale stood opposite Anya, the great map still between them. The external battle was over. They had won. He could not see the flush of victory on her cheeks or the awe in her eyes as she looked at him. But he could hear the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that had become as familiar to him as his own. She could not see the violent storm of emotions within him, the pride, the gratitude, the sheer, staggering revelation of what they had just accomplished. But she could see the tension finally leave his shoulders, a lifetime of burdens momentarily lifted. Their alliance, born of necessity, had been tempered in conflict and had emerged as something far stronger, far deeper. The war with the Baron was over, but the quiet revolution in their own hearts had just reached its turning point. The victory against the Baron brought a new kind of silence to Stonehaven. It was not the heavy silence of grief, nor the tense silence of a siege. It was a silence of peace, deep and restorative. The fortress seemed to breathe again, its stone lungs filled with clean, fresh air. The soldiers' laughter could be heard in the courtyard, and Iona, for the first time since Anya had arrived, was seen with a softness around her eyes. The external threat had vanished, leaving behind a space for something new to grow. In the quiet hours of the next dawn, Cale sought out Anya. He did not need to ask where she would be. He followed the faint scent of damp earth and blooming night phlox, his footsteps sure and steady, on the stone path leading to the garden. He found her there, kneeling in the soft dirt, her hands tending to a new row of seedlings. The rising sun was just beginning to cast a pale, golden light over the world, catching in her hair and turning it to threads of spun copper. She heard him approach and looked up, a gentle smile touching her lips. In the past weeks, his presence had become a comfort, a steady anchor in her new life. He stopped a few feet from her, his posture relaxed, his face turned toward the brightening horizon he could not see. "Anya," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble that seemed to be for her ears alone, "tell me what it looks like." She stilled, understanding his question was not a simple one. He was not asking for a report, he was asking for a piece of her world. She rose slowly, standing beside him, and turned her gaze to the east. "It begins with a single line of pale gold," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "right at the very edge of the moors. It's thin and sharp, like a crack in a dark stone. Then the color begins to bleed upwards from gold into a soft, pale pink, the color of the inside of a seashell." Cale closed his scarred eyes, listening, his entire being focused on her voice. "The clouds floating above the line are catching the light now," she continued, a sense of wonder in her own voice. "Their bellies are turning a deep, rich purple, but their edges are traced in silver. The darkness isn't vanishing all at once, it's melting, and the The light is so gentle. It touches the leaves of the plants, and you can almost see them waking up, turning their faces toward the warmth. She let out a soft breath. It feels like a promise. As she spoke of the light, he moved. He reached out, not for her hand, but with a slow, deliberate reverence, and placed his palm gently against her cheek. His touch was warm, the calluses on his warrior's hand impossibly soft against her skin. She drew a sharp, silent breath, her heart seeming to stop in her chest. His thumb stroked softly along her cheekbone as his fingers traced the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of profound discovery, of a man mapping a world more vital than any he had ever known. He was not seeing her with his eyes, he was seeing her with his soul. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek where his thumb had been. He felt its warmth. For 5 years, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had never allowed himself to show, my world has been nothing but shades of darkness, of memory and regret. He drew a deep, shuddering breath. You have taught me to see more than my eyes ever could, Anya. It was a confession. It was an absolution. It was a declaration more powerful than any poem. It was the truth of a healed soul, laid bare in the quiet of the dawn. Anya raised her own hand and placed it over his, pressing his palm more firmly against her face. She did not need to speak. Her touch was her answer. In that moment, the titles that had defined them fell away. He was not the blind general, and she was not the accused witch. He was Cale, a man who had found light in the darkness, and she was Anya, a woman who had found a home in the heart of a fortress. Two solitary souls, two broken halves, had finally, irrevocably, found their whole in one another. In the weeks that followed the siege, a royal delegation, summoned by a message Cale had sent before the blockade, arrived at Stonehaven. They came to investigate the Baron's illegal war and found a truth far darker than they had imagined. Anya's testimony, combined with the accounts of Cale's loyal men, painted a clear picture of Baron Valerius's tyranny. When they investigated the disaster at the Crimson Field, the original flawed map provided by the Baron was found in the royal archives, proving his treachery. The justice was as swift as it was poetic. Anya's remedies, shared freely with the Baron's former lands, began to heal the people, and she was hailed as the healer of Oakhaven. Stripped of his titles and lands, shunned by the very people he had terrorized, Valerius was exiled, a bitter, powerless man, forced to wander the lands he had once ruled. His shadow was lifted from the world, leaving only clear, open skies. Years passed. The stone of the fortress, once a symbol of isolation and grief, warmed in the summer sun. The garden, once a forgotten patch of weeds, now overflowed with life, its vibrant colors and rich scents a testament to the love that had nurtured it. Stonehaven was no longer a fortress, it was a home. Anya sat on a simple stone bench, the afternoon sun warming her face. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in terror, but the confident, serene lady of Stonehaven. Beside her sat Kyle. The lines of pain that had once been carved so deeply around his eyes had softened, replaced by a permanent calm. He was not just a general or a lord, he was a husband and a father. A few feet away, a small boy with his mother's observant brown eyes and his father's determined chin knelt in the dirt. His name was Lorien. He was carefully tending to a small mint plant, his small hands gentle and precise as he patted the soil around its base. He looked up at his mother, holding up a single, perfect leaf. "It smells like sweet rain, Mama," he said, his voice clear and bright. Anya smiled, her heart full. "It does, my love." Kyle, listening, smiled too. It was a genuine, easy smile that reached the corners of his scarred eyes. He could not see his son's face, alight with discovery. He could not see the vibrant green of the leaf or the deep love in his wife's expression, but he could see everything that mattered. He heard the rustle of the leaves as his son moved among them. He heard the boy's happy, curious chatter, the sound of a life just beginning, full of wonder. He felt the warmth of Anya's hand as it slipped into his, her touch as familiar and as vital as his own heartbeat. He smelled the rich scent of the soil and the sweet perfume of the roses she had planted along the wall. This was his world. It was not a world of sight, but of sensation, of feeling, of a profound and abiding love. He had once been a man trapped in a prison of darkness and regret, but Anya had not given him back his sight. She had given him something far more precious. She had given him a world worth seeing. He leaned his head slightly, resting it against hers, and together they sat in a comfortable, perfect silence, listening to the beautiful sound of their son discovering the world. The greatest wounds are not always the ones we can see, and the truest vision is born not in the eyes, but in the heart. A quiet kindness can be a key, and a gentle hand can lead a soul out of darkness and into the light. If this story of healing and love has touched you, share it with someone who brings light into your world.